Hello, I'm Jenna Croteau. I'm a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I work with Dr. Park in the Cognitive and Developmental Neuroscience Lab. And today I'm going to be talking about symbolic cognition and its relations to numerical thinking. So before I begin, I just want to give an overview of the talk because it's structured a little bit differently, so I'm not going to be giving a lot of background. Instead, I'm going to try to cram 3 experiments into the talk. And then hopefully, if there's time, I'll talk about future directions. But just before I even begin, I just want to preface that the thing that I'm really trying to take away from this talk is that children's number concepts undergo qualitative changes across development. And specifically, I think those qualitative changes are triggered by symbolic acquisition. So learning things about verbal numerals and then also Arabic notation. So again, this isn't going to be about causal evidence. It's really more correlational and suggestive of that idea. But that's really the research that I'm interested in doing. So first experiment, so this was designed to investigate whether or not 14 to 23-month-old infants represent small numbers, so specifically 1, 2, and 3 abstractly. And so in order to get at this question, we recruited infants through Lookit, which is this online developmental platform for asynchronous and then also synchronous developmental studies. So this was an asynchronous study, and we recorded their looking behavior through the webcam. So we used this paradigm from Shekla and de Villiers. We just borrowed it. And so there's 3 phases in this paradigm. First, there's a fixation period, then an anticipatory period, and then a reward. And there's 2 types of stimuli that we show, so a target and a non-target. And the thing that makes a target is its category membership. So in this case, it would be the vertical lines, and then the non-target category would be any other line orientation. And so importantly, during that anticipatory period, the target and the non-target are both stationary and grayscaled. And then during that reward period, the target starts flashing. And so importantly, if children can represent that target category during that anticipatory period, at least after a couple of trials, they should start anticipating which side of the screen is going to light up. So we adapted this design to assess whether or not children could form abstract categories for the numbers 1, 2, and 3. So I'm showing you an example trial from the first experiment where the target was equal to 1. So the exact same phases, again, anticipatory period, reward, and the fixation. And then in order to assess abstract number, we varied the shapes across trials. So on this trial, there were stars, but then on other trials, there were circles or triangles. And importantly, we also made sure that we systematically varied the size and the spacing of the shapes so that they couldn't use any low-level perceptual cues to form those implicit target categories. So again, we had a target equal to the cardinality of 1, and then 2, and then 3. And importantly, too, we use the same stimuli across the 3 different experiments. So really, the only thing that's changing between the experiments is which side of the screen is going to light up. So in this case, with the target equal to 1, you see that there's the 1 star over here that's lit up, but then over here it would be 3 when the target's equal to 3. Obviously, we couldn't do the 2 versus 3 when the target was equal to 1, but again, it's pretty much the same stimuli across the 3 experiments. So moving into predictive results, so we use the normalized left-right looking ratio rather than raw looking time. We use this just to control for any systematic biases. So sometimes we get babies who look a lot to the left or a lot to the right. So we wanted to make sure we get that preferential looking. And so in the most extreme case, if babies are always looking to the left, they should be at a ratio equal to 1, so all the way over here. And then if they're always looking to the right, they'd be all the way over here. And then here's the chance line. So if infants can represent small numbers abstractly, what we should find is those boxes really separate, right? So when the target's on the left side of the screen, the babies are looking to the left more often, and then when the target's on the right side of the screen, they're looking to the right side more often. But if they don't represent small numbers abstractly, what we should instead see is those boxes really straddling that chance line there. So here's what we found. So 14 to 23-month-old infants, they showed a significantly difference in their looking time ratio when the target was on the left compared to the right in the 1 condition. And this is a pretty big effect. So again, they're looking to the left more often when 1 is on the left, and then they're looking to the right more often when 1 is on the right. By contrast, we got a null effect when the target was equal to 2, and the Bayes factor for this indicated a moderate level of support for the null hypothesis, so we're pretty confident in this null result. And then when the target was equal to 3, we found this kind of like marginally significant effect. However, it looked like babies were looking to the left more often when the target was on the right, and then looking to the right more often when the target was on the left. And then given that the Bayes factor for this only indicated anecdotal support for the alternative hypothesis, and then given that the paired contrast between the 3 versus the 1 was significant, but not between the 2 and the 3 condition, we're pretty sure this is just like a spurious finding. So just interim conclusion. So we found that 14 to 23-month-old infants were able to form abstract representations of 1 and use those relationally, but they weren't able to do the same with sets of 2 and 3. So if children don't have these representations of 2 and 3 as abstract representations, at least early in development, we were interested in how children first think about those numbers. And so for experiment 2, we were interested in how do young children interpret words like 2 and 3. So do they understand that 2 can really refer to any set of 2 objects, so say an orange and a banana, or do they think that 2 really refers to 2 of the same kind, so 2 bananas or 2 oranges? And so to do this, we recruited 44 English-speaking children. We had 3 tasks in a fixed order, so interval counting, give n, and musical barnyard. I'm going to skip the give n results. I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. They're interesting, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip them for now. So this interval counting task, we had 4 intervals we had the children count. So from 15, we would ask them, could you keep counting? So 15, 16, 17, 18, and so on, until they stopped counting or they got to 24. And what we were measuring here was their number of successful decade transitions, so something we call their DT score. So they earned 1 point towards their DT score for each successful decade transition that they made. So in this case, it would be going from 19 to 20. And then we also classified kids into 2 groups based on this interval counting task. So if children were able to get a DT score greater than or equal to 4, we classified those as productive counters. The reason we did that was because of pilot data indicated that this was like a statistically significant cutoff in qualitative performance, but also because theoretically this also makes sense. So there's 1 decade transition between 15 and 24, so 19 to 20, and then 2 and 37 to 51, so right, 39 to 40, 49 to 50, and then finally 99 to 100, that gets you to 4. So these are the kids who are counting beyond 100. So that suggests maybe there's something qualitatively different about these kids. Next, we use this musical barnyard task, which we adapted from Walker and Gopnik 2017. So we told the kids that we brought a musical barnyard and that some things made it play music and some things don't, but it was their job to figure out how the barn works, and we would give them 1 hint. So we would tell them either 2, mix the barn, play music, or 3, mix the barn, play music, and then we would encourage them to play with the barn to see how it works. So we would shuffle a basket of toys, and then we would let the children pick toys out of the basket to put into the barn. So then we would confirm their response, say, should we try these? If the child confirmed, then we would walk them in the barn. And if the child selected the right number of items, then the barn would play music. So if the hint was for 2, and they selected 2 items, regardless of the items they selected, it would make the barn play music. And likewise for 3. And the dependent measure for this task was whether or not the sets were homogeneous or heterogeneous. So did they pick 2 of the same kind, or did they pick 2 different? The same thing for 3. So here's what we found. We found our unproductive counters. So those are, again, are the kids who aren't counting past 100. They preferred to produce homogeneous sets of quantities about 69% of the time. And this was statistically significantly different from the productive counters who did not show this same homogeneous bias. And importantly, those productive counters, their response looks more like what we might expect if they were just randomly grabbing from the basket. So just interim conclusions again. We found that unproductive counters showed a strong homogeneous kind bias when interpreting small number words, so things like 2 and 3, but the productive counters didn't. And so we think this suggests that children first understand small numbers as referring to sets of identical kinds, and they only refine their understanding after extensive training with the verbal numeral system. And so that leads me to my 3rd experiment, which is a little bit more open-ended, but really exploring how does the syntax, so specifically verbal numeral syntax, but also Arabic notation, influence the way that children think about numbers. And so for this study, we use Look It Again, so the same platform from experiment 1. This was asynchronous as well, so using the webcam to record the responses and then also the children's clicks. So we recruited 311 4 to 8-year-old native English-speaking children, and it was an open-ended free response task. So we just told the children, can you say or write any number larger than the number that we gave them? So we had two conditions, an Arabic condition and a verbal condition. So each child got both conditions in an order counterbalanced way. And then they got 8 trials in each condition. So in the Arabic condition, the farmer would write down a number, and the child had to write down a number larger, either on a piece of paper or a whiteboard, and hold it up to the webcam for us to see. And then in the verbal condition, the farmer would say a number, and then they had to say a number that was larger than what the farmer said. Importantly, they got 2 trials, which were the same across both the Arabic and verbal conditions. So for example, in this case, maybe the child received 400 in both the Arabic and verbal. So before I get into the results for this study, I just want to say, this is hot off the press. We just finished our qualitative coding. 311 kids is a lot to get through, going through the webcams, and then also we classified their responses. So this is very preliminary results, just to preface that. So moving into some of the more broader qualitative coding categories, at least for the verbal condition, we classified responses into grammatical, non-canonical, and then ungrammatical uses of number phrase syntax. So I think the grammatical and ungrammatical are pretty straightforward, but the non-canonical uses reflected these cases where children were kind of using a phrase with 100, so things like 1000 or 6900, or stacking lots of multipliers together, so things like 6,000,000 or 100,000 million. And those, importantly, while they're not really standard phrase syntax for numerical phrases, they are reflected in colloquial American English. So parents say things like, oh, in the 1900s or the 1800s. So we wanted to make sure we weren't classifying those as ungrammatical because they're not strictly ungrammatical. So we found the vast majority of kids produce grammatical responses. So this is collapsed across all the different age bins. And then I'm not showing you this here, but obviously the number of grammatical responses increases with age. Perhaps more interesting, so these are the 5 most common response categories. So these are these more nuanced categories that we had. These were mutually exclusive. And so the first most common was this identical structure. So these were children who were really copying the phrase structure of the probe in their response. So if we said something like 100, they were saying something like 800 or 900. Then we had our uncategorizable responses. So this is reflecting those ungrammatical and non-canonical phrase structures. And then finally, this multiple changes here, that was the 3rd most common. These were the kids who were really not following the syntax of the probe at all and adding on a lot of different stuff to it. I'm going to skip the last 2 for the sake of time, but importantly, we had more than these 5 categories, and I'm happy to talk about how we came up with these categories in the Q&A. So this brings me to, I think, what is most interesting about what we've found, at least so far, just looking at the data, and that's that children who are influenced by the probe structure, so the probe syntax, those children are right about 84% of the time, versus the children who are making multiple changes to the syntax were only correct about 60% of the time. And then those uncategorizable responses are only correct about 53% of the time. So these are kids who are unable to generate those larger numbers, say 40% of the time, or about 48% of the time. And so what that indicates is that the children who are primed by the syntax, so presumably the children who have mastered the syntax, those children are more likely to be able to correctly generate a larger number. So moving into Arabic, so again, we had these mutually exclusive categories. We found in this case that multiple changes to the probe structure was the most common response. The next most common was generating a very large number, so that was adding on a lot of digits to the probe. I think we classified this as at least 3 or more digits added to the probe. And then the last 3 categories all have to do with changing the head digit. So importantly, changing the first digit in the probe. What I want you to take away from this is really these response categories are very different than what you see in the verbal syntax. So even these 4-year-old children are really being influenced by the different format of the numeral. And then again, perhaps the most interesting thing that we're finding is that the children who aren't really influenced by that structure of the probe, so those children who are making multiple changes to the probe in a way that's not really categorizable to us, those children are more likely to generate incorrect responses. So we found that multiple changes were moderately correlated with producing incorrect responses, and obviously that's decreasing across age. So again, suggesting those children who are influenced by the syntax are more likely to generate those correct responses. So again, some interim conclusions. So we found that most kids were highly influenced by the syntax and the format of the numeral system, at least when asked to generate a larger number. And then that kids who have yet to master the syntax had a harder time generating a larger number. So future directions, I'm just gonna skip this for now for the sake of time so I can get to the Q&A, but I have lots of different ideas about where to go with this research. And then just to end with some conclusions. So really what I want you to take away is that early representations of number, at least small number, are limited, and that learning different symbolic representations of numbers, so perhaps number phrase syntax and Arabic notation, may facilitate those qualitative changes. Again, I didn't present causal evidence of that, right? We would need to do some type of training study, which is something I would like to do, but I think these results are highly suggestive of that idea. And so with that, thank you all for listening. Thank you to Dr. Park for supervising me on all of this research, and then all of the RAs, parents, families, and community partners that made this possible.
Questions?
Thank you for a really nice presentation and a really good question. I'm curious about a piece that you mentioned. You popped into the middle there, but didn't pick up on, I'm sure because of time, which was that some group of children were more likely to pick two members of the same kind versus members of different kinds. And I know that you wanted to make some conclusion about that with regard to abstractness. And I'd love to hear more. And before I hear more, just to point out that for other descriptors besides number, adjective descriptors, for example, are best learned when the contrast is within rather than across kinds. And so I would just love to hear your interpretation.
Yeah, no, I think
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think this is a really good question. So if we think about number concepts strictly, it really shouldn't matter the format, right? Like the objects that we're using to quantify. So if you are asked or you're told that say 2 or 3 makes something play music, then you should just really grab randomly from that basket. And when we run this study with adults, that's what we find, right? The adults just grab randomly from the basket. But what we're finding is these younger kids, the kids who haven't mastered the phrase syntax of verbal numerals, so these are the kids who maybe don't understand either like the digit multiplier syntax, so things like 60, 70, or maybe the kids who don't understand the modularity in that verbal counting system, so when you get to 9, that you restart and you go to 0. That those kids are not making that same type of inference, right? That it doesn't matter what type of object that you're grabbing. You might think, oh, well, maybe it's just because these also are the younger kids, right? The kids who haven't mastered that syntax also tend to be the younger kids. But with the give-n task, we have that same group, right? Those younger kids, and we don't find that same result that we found with the verbal counting. And so really, it seems like it's something specific about mastering that verbal counting that's driving that homogeneous kind effect. And if I had to speculate where that's coming from, it's that early language input, right? Grown-ups are saying to kids things like, grab 2 shoes, or can you grab 2 yogurts? And so they're hearing numbers with also a noun phrase that's quantifying over that kind, and that's kind of inducing that early bias. So it's not until they get training with like, say that abstract verbal numeral system, or maybe they're getting formal training in school that they really understand numbers as abstract and quantifying over anything. Yeah.
Thank you, that was really nice. I'm curious about your first study where you did the adaptation of the de Villiers implicit learning paradigm. When you taught 2, was it, maybe you mentioned it and I just missed it, I'm just curious about it. Was it always contrasted with 3, or was it alternating contrasted with 3 and 1, or did you do different studies where sometimes it was contrasted with 3 and sometimes with 1?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't think I was specific either. So 2 was contrasted equally with 1 and 3. So they got 32 trials, so half of them it was contrasted with 1, and then half of them with 3, and that was in a random order. The stimuli were the same across all the different experiments, but importantly, the exact like randomization was equal between the 2. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I mean, I guess we have some very preliminary suggestive evidence from our lab that sometimes 2 and 3 get kind of lumped into a category in that a very young age group. And so I wonder if you would get different results if you systematically either contrasted 2 with 1 or 2 from 3.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good, and if I had to speculate, my guess is that if you contrasted 1 with just 2 or 1 with just 3, you would get that discrimination, because it seems like the babies do have that representation of 1, right? So maybe they can use 1 and then not 1, at least if they have negation, which I know is controversial in this age group, so.
We have time for one final question before lunch. I can ask it. So how do you reconcile the failures of the infants in your first experiment with the cracker task, where they seem to be able to discriminate between until up to 3?
Yeah.
So how,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's the $1 million question. I really don't know how to reconcile this finding with like the other studies. One thing that I've been thinking about, and I think Melissa Kibbe talks about this in one of her responses to that language of thought article in BBS, and that we really don't know what the format of those object file representations are. And so I don't know what this suggests about them, but it certainly suggests something about it being in the here and now, or something to do with this attentional indexing, and that potentially 2 and 3 go beyond the attentional capacity or working memory capacity of those infants. So because we're asking them to hold in mind that representation of 2 and then compare it to another 2, maybe that's like exceeding the representational capacity of the infants, but maybe something that's more first order is accessible to them, but that second order comparison is missing. But again, that's just speculation. I really don't know what to make of this. I feel like it is very contrastive with like the whole literature. So I was a little scared to present the results here.
Thank you.